So we are going to begin, and I am going to introduce this session, Gender Inclusive Language and the LGBTQ plus community with Christine Mallinson and Jay Insco, and I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves because they can do a better job of that. Thank you so much. Christine and Jay, just let me know when you want me to go to the next slide. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all so much. This is so exciting to see so many folks attending and so many familiar faces. We really appreciate you joining us. I'm Christine Mallinson. I'm professor in the Language, Literacy, and Culture PhD program at UMBC, pronouns she, her, hers. And I also direct our Center for Social Science Scholarship at UMBC. I'm a sociolinguist, which means that I study language in its social context with an emphasis on English. So much of what we're talking about today will give examples from English, but there's a great body of literature that also talks about these same issues in other languages as well. So just pointing out that, that global piece. I'll let Jay introduce themselves and then I'll get started.
Hi, my name is Jay Insco. I use they, them pronouns. I am a student in LLC, Language, Literacy, and Culture. Hopefully defending my dissertation within a year, so that's frightening, terrifying, horrible. I am Christine Mallinson and Jason Movilio's student slash advisee slash graduate assistant slash mentee. My research is at the intersection of gender, media, and language. And recently I've been working on my dissertation about radio conservative superstar Paul Harvey and the development of an authoritative masculine, white masculine straight voice in radio over the past 100 years.
All right. So I'm going to talk about the first half, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jay. So next slide, Catalina, please. Thank you. So we want to just start by considering the question, is language just talk? Or is it something more than that? So since you all are here, I imagine you're already right there with us. Language is important. And I was so inspired by listening this morning to the panels that came before this one, where each of our speakers has pointed out how important language is to social justice and to social change. Language is intersectional. It's something that each of us has the power to marshal every day in our efforts for change. Today's presentation, we're going to focus on how we can think about language change when it comes to gender and sexuality. But again, just wanted to establish that broader context about how important language is to all facets of society and the calls for action that we're seeing. So I'm going to start off with 3 examples. Next slide, please. So let's consider just 3 situations that you all might have experienced or seen something about or had somebody ask you or ask these questions yourself. The term you guys. Is it gender neutral? Is it masculine? Is it sexist to use it? Is it not sexist to use it? Mr. Why do we have just Mr. for men, but for women? Oh, I think Ms. got chopped off there, but it's, oh, there it is. Mr. versus Mrs., Miss, or Ms. Why do we have 3 terms of address for women and only 1 for men? Pronouns, what does it mean when someone changes their pronouns? What should you do? These are just 3 examples. And I think we can sort of look to these examples as representative of what are some of the issues that come up for us when we think about in society how language isn't just talk, how the ways that people use language can reveal and enforce harmful stereotypes sometimes, but also how language can be used to challenge prevailing norms and conventions and be a vehicle for social change. So we're going to talk about some of the ways that we can think about things like whether we should use you guys or why we have non-parallel terms of address or what it means when somebody changes their pronouns. And we're going to be looking through this at this through a lens of striving for gender inclusivity because we take the stand that when we use gender inclusive language, we're not only signaling that we're valuing equity, we're also speaking it into being through the words that we use, which can help advance social progress for people of all genders. Next slide, please. So language, here are a couple linguistic axioms about language and how it operates. The first thing to know is that language is always changing. This is very important. Anyone who studies language or inhabits language, which is all of us as language users, we need to know and get comfortable with the notion that the language that was used 200 years ago, 100 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago may not be the language that is the same language today or in the future. Language will continue to change. Sometimes it changes ahead of societal beliefs and social behaviors, and sometimes it lags behind. So it's not always an indicator, but it can be. Third, while it's true that simply changing our language doesn't guarantee societal change, it's also the case that raising awareness of language, linguistic bias, gendered linguistic bias, and so forth can have real social impact. So we're going to look now at a couple historical examples of gender-related linguistic and social change that have happened over time. And then at in the next part of the presentation, just to kind of give you a preview, we'll be talking about some strategies for how you can think about gender-inclusive language. But I want you to see some examples of how language has, in fact, changed over time in these ways so far. Next slide, please, Catalina. Okay, so you can see a timeline here that I'm just going to talk you through a bit. This demonstrates how language and gender and sexuality issues in English have changed over time. And again, this is not, these examples are specific to English, but there are many more examples than these. So let's take as our first consideration the situation of singular they. For example, in sentences like, if a student misses class, they must make up their work. If you take a look at the far right of the timeline, which is our contemporary moments, you'll see that nowadays in contemporary usage, singular they is a very important word. So in 2015, it was voted Word of the Year by the American Dialect Society. Again, in 2019 by Merriam-Webster. Then in 2020, it was voted Word of the Decade and other accolades as well. All of these rankings were in recognition that singular they has become an important pronoun for people who identify as transgender, gender fluid, or non-binary, or just who want to embrace that gender inclusivity piece. Now, this makes it seem like the use of singular they is new. However, it has a long historical context. On the one hand, the use of singular they specifically to indicate non-binary gender, that's what we're seeing the rise of here in contemporary times. But it's important to point out the use of singular they has always been used widely in English. It's existed since at least the 1300s, which is the earliest written record that we have of it. And over those centuries, it was used widely, it was used routinely. So we see it in Chaucer and so forth. Back then, the usage was considered completely unremarkable, completely normal. That was the case until the 1700s, which you can see on the far left side of your timeline, which is when grammarians in the UK decided to argue, based on wanting English to appear similar to Latin and French, that masculine forms were more comprehensive. And in fact, they even said more worthy than feminine forms. This is not the first instance, you know, of language forms associated with women being stigmatized, but this is a particularly important one because, as you can see, it was connected to Parliament. There's more there that I can get into, but this started a whole chain reaction where language arbiters, dictionary makers, parliamentarians came to decide that not only should we be using masculine forms for everyone, we also shouldn't be using singular they. So at that moment, once they decided singular they was ungrammatical, these rules, you know, sort of got implemented and reinforced, and then the notion stuck. And it's taken us really hundreds of years to sort of circle back to where we are now, which is us recognizing once again that singular they is normal, it's widely used, it's very efficient in the English language, and it's also super useful as a gender neutral pronoun. So if you ever have the option to use singular they, or to let other people know that it's not only okay to use it, but also is a positive thing to use, please do. And a lot of experimental research has shown that singular they is the least biased pronoun that we can use in terms of evoking images or stereotypes of male versus female speakers. It completely circumvents that. You can also see other highlights here on the timeline for places where we've seen movements to make the English language more gender equitable. So from the 60s and 70s, when activists, including Gloria Steinem and other folks, pushed for the word Ms., now it's connected to her, of course, with the magazine, Ms. Magazine, that would designate gender but not marital status. So the idea was, just like Mr., we wanted to be able to refer to women in ways that didn't immediately signal some sort of marital status for them. And now Ms. is widely used. In the 1970s, we also saw the term mix get coined, which is MX period. it's as a term of address for transgender or non-binary individuals. These days, it's started to catch on a little bit more widely, especially in England, where it's an option on many government forms, driver's licenses, bank paperwork, so forth. In the 70s and 80s, there was also a pretty widespread effort to abolish non-parallel terms in other regards, like fireman or stewardess, in favor of gender-neutral terms like firefighter or flight attendant, which are now used pretty widely. So that is a way that, through these examples, attention was drawn to the need for folks to avoid using language that skewed male. This also included pronouns, like the job applicant should submit his resume, or each student should get out his book. We now know, because of this body of research that's been conducted, that activates stereotypes and biases. And so now there are very widespread efforts to make sure that wording is presented in a gender neutral or gender inclusive way in schools and companies and so forth. And this is important. Again, experimental studies have found, for example, on things like job ads, when wording has that male generic use, like every job applicant should submit his resume, findings reveal that men feel especially encouraged to apply for those job ads, as you might imagine, and women feel discouraged to apply because they get the impression that the job ad is not geared for them. So that's just one example of how biased language can lead to inequalities in things like jobs, access, and also things like workplace satisfaction and so forth. And then finally, to go back to sort of the present day side, we see intersectional, national, international, global movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter, where language, whether it's in the form of hashtags or protests, is galvanizing people through calls to action to pursue social change. Okay, next slide, Catalina. So what's next? Where do we go from here? What's the next frontier for change when it comes to language, gender, and sexuality? So one of the key conceptual points for you all to take away with you today is that people are capable and powerful linguistic agents. That means we each have the power to use language purposefully, intersectionally, in ways that can bring about social change. So even small shifts in how we use language. For instance, if we decide to change whether or not we say something like you guys, that can be a way of us signaling to other people that we're taking a certain position on working to be linguistically inclusive in the way that we're communicating. And if more and more people start doing the same thing, it can signal that widespread societal change might be starting to happen on that frontier. Just like when people first started saying flight attendant instead of stewardess and so forth. Sometimes it can take a while to catch on, but then all of a sudden it just seems commonplace, right? And we sort of get it. So it remains to be seen whether something like you guys might change over time, but it might be a good term to watch. Even though it's still really widespread and many people use it, many people claim it's gender neutral. At the same time, we are increasingly seeing people recognizing that it does have a masculine bent to it, and a lot of folks are opting to use words that are non-gendered, like you all, y'all, folks, things like that. So we can look at even small words like you guys to see where language might be changing, as well as where society might be headed. Okay, next slide, Catalina, and I'll turn it over to Jay.
Hi. So speaking of change, what do we need to do to achieve gender-inclusive language? Linguists have long held that it can be very hard to change one's linguistic habits. It's actually a fun name for it called fossilization. And it can be especially hard to change those that have been developed over a lifetime. But it is possible. And not only that, but people do actively seek to change their linguistic habits. Research finds that people who use gender-inclusive language tend to do so because they're not only aware of gender-based linguistic inequalities, but also actively seek linguistic change. And we can see that both in terms of being inclusive and trying to find ways to control language in ways that will exclude folk. So Dr. Mallinson brought up Black Lives Matter recently, and I think everyone else is familiar here with the responses to Black Lives Matter, both the All Lives Matters and Blue Lives Matter groups, but also the social change kind of movements that are like Black trans lives matter, right? People are very aware of the power of language and always seek to change how we talk about things in order to change what they mean. So next slide, please. We recently published a 2-page policy brief on these issues that include 5 suggestions that we'll be talking about here. They implement gender-inclusive language, whether in workplace or schools, via policies or regulations, or simply as part of everyday interactions. The brief itself is called What is Gender-Inclusive Language and Why Does It Matter? For the Scholar Strategy Network, which you can download. We're having a little bit of trouble with searching it up, but we have a link for it in the additional resources later in this presentation. Next slide, please. So the first strategy we want to share with you is, and these are very simplified forms of those strategies, is to pay attention to names and naming conventions. Ask for a person's preferred name and pronouns instead of assuming based off of legal documentation. Because, as those of you who are trans or know transgender folk would know, legal name changes are difficult and they are expensive and they are a bit of a process. When referring to women, use Miss unless otherwise specified, instead of depending on trying to use a different title based off of marital status. When referring to someone's spouse or child, you can ask, is their last name the same as yours or different, again, instead of assuming. And of course, accept that preferred names, pronouns, and titles may change over time. And that can run counter to the general red tape of any organization. Recently, speaking as a PhD student, I had to interact with the grad school and trying to get in paperwork regarding my dissertation. And there was quite a bit to do about my preferred name, which is assigned on UMBC as Jay, and my dead name, which is Jonathan, including emails which consistently refer to me as he, his, him, and all that good stuff. So preferred names, pronouns, and titles may change over time, and being aware of that can certainly help. Second, avoid using asymmetrical language. So if you're referring to men as men, also refer to women as women, not as girls, ladies, or females. That one sends a bit of a cringe up my spine. If referring to men by their title, such as Dr. or Mr., do the same for women, especially in meetings, during speaker panels, at conferences, etc. I saw that my acquaintance Romy Hubler is on the call, and she certainly shared a couple of stories of me about being at events and having the men near her introduced as Doctor rather than her, only being introduced by her first name rather than her title. Finally, for that, consider gender-neutral titles for everyone. You can use M instead of Mr. or Miss. That's just M with the period, or job-specific titles. I tell my students to call me professor. It's a gender-neutral term, and maybe there's something to say about, you know, the prestige that's attached to that. But I certainly appreciate having something that is gender-neutral and easy for students to keep up with. Chairperson is another one. Chair is another title that you can use. Doctor as well. Thirdly, make sure that official forms and surveys offer options. Allow individuals to designate their own gender, or if it is necessary to provide options, include they as an alternative to the traditional male-female binary. Understand that previous official documentation, just to speak on that a bit more, may not reflect an individual's preferred name, pronoun, or titles. Again, legal name changes are difficult, and sometimes we are unable to start that name change process. Consider asking individuals to designate their spouse or partner rather than husband or wife, or to identify the parent rather than the mother or the father. Next slide, please. Strategy 4, well, for Strategy 4 and Strategy 5, in thinking about social justice as both a process and a goal, we want to think about not only creating a gender-inclusive culture, but promoting a space that is active and critical and constantly working towards those goals. Ensure that official records, directories, databases, forms, etc., reflect preferred names and pronouns. Encourage individuals to share their preferred names and pronouns and make the effort to consistently use them. When mistakes happen, acknowledge them, reflect on them, and implement strategies for change. We have a presentation coming up about creating a style guide, create a style guide, or gender neutral language policy, and hold trainings to establish familiarity with that policy. It wasn't too long ago in preparing for this presentation, there was an article Retriever about students struggling with professors who were continually misgendering them. So it's definitely something that is still happening on campus and still needs to be addressed. Strategy 5, promoting an active critical organization space. Listen to colleagues, staff, students, and employees when they report experiencing hostile environments or interactions. Establish a standing committee to review and incorporate scholarly research and activism, gather feedback, and assess state and federal policies regarding gender and sexuality discrimination in the workplace or elsewhere. And avoid considering diversity work as being finished, closed, or good enough. There's nothing more poisonous to a social movement than believing that we have merely achieved our goals instead of continually working towards them in our changing environment. Next slide, please. So we have some additional resources here for you. We have the Linguistic Society of America Guidelines for Inclusive Language and the UMBC Guidelines on Inclusive and Affirming Language. I also wanted to point out Lambda Legal's site on Transgender Advocates Guide to Updating and Amending School Records, because it outlines the protections that are afforded trans folk. Legal sort of ramifications for not protecting trans folks' identities and affirming their identities, and what you as an advocate for trans folk can do. And then finally, our brief, what is gender inclusive language and why does it matter, which you can find a link there. And next. So that is it. We're going to open the floor to Q&A. Dr. Mountain may want to take it from here. She's a little more directive.
I'll help triage here. So if anybody, we have just a couple minutes, I think, for questions. If anybody wants to chime in, I did have pointed out while I'm waiting for folks to submit any questions that there is a wide movement for gender neutral pronouns in other languages. For instance, Swedish, which the language change in Sweden has really taken off in the past decade and now provides many options for gender neutral pronouns to be used. And then, of course, this is connected with other things like making sure that, children's clothes are presented as children's clothes and not just boys' clothes and girls' clothes and toys and so forth. So we can look to other cultures and communities for really important directions that we could go in the U.S. How to handle someone who refuses to even try to use preferred pronouns. I think it's important, to understand that there may often be context surrounding some of that. I think I always prefer to start with one-on-one conversations just to try to understand context. If that's not possible, I think sharing resource lists is always important. Would you recommend adding preferred pronouns to college applications and everywhere else possible in forms? Absolutely. How best would you recommend to word these? Definitely. I think giving multiple options is good. Open-ended sometimes can be a challenge on surveys just in terms of data collection, but open-ended is always good. If that's not possible, as many options as you see being used in your community, or you can consult the literature on this. If you all can always look at any of the resources that we have here that can help guide those. But I think each of us can be change agents in our own organizations, where you can say, look, I see things like these style guides, and I'd like to recommend that we take a look at some of our policies or forms.
I wanted to bring up, I had a question here from Courtney Hobson. Hi, Courtney. How do you feel about using they as default pronouns in people? I am frankly open about people adopting the gender neutral they. I think as history has shown, singular they has been used for quite some time. It's not some newfangled word used by disgruntled millennials to refer to folk. So I am very much in support of it, even as someone who personally uses they, them as pronouns. Also, there's something nice about the, that sense of plurality there that I quite like. Even if it's singular they, the acknowledgement of a multiplicity of feelings about gender and ways of performing gender is a nice connotation in my mind.
So some folks are asking about updated guidelines. I think the UMBC style guide it does get updated and so forth. You can always look to the Linguistic Society of America webpage. Those should be updated. I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to say, you can always ask folks, and I think now there's a more widespread movement for folks to share what pronouns are useful for them. So I would just encourage, in the spirit of inclusive communication, to also making sure that we inclusively communicate with those those around us about what our preferences are and what their preferences are as well. So I'll turn it back over to Catalina, and thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you to you both for your amazing words. And like in every session, I encourage all of you to take this information and put it into practice in all the sectors of your lives, especially when there are people who don't identify with any of these, because that's when the true power of these lessons come into play, when nobody's watching, when those people that you're trying to stand up for are not there. Thank you so much. I don't think we posted the next session. Oh, yes, we did. And it's the same password, UMBC20. Thank you so much and have a great day.